Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The plenary session from trade wars to war economies, our conflicts rewiring global markets is about to begin. Translation is available. Channel 1 is for English, Channel 2 is for French, Channel 3 is for Arabic, and Channel 4 is for Spanish. And now, please welcome to the stage our moderator for this session, Gallagher Fenwick, reporter and former manager-editor at France 24.
Hello everyone. My name, as you just heard, is Gallagher Fenwick. It's an absolute pleasure to be back at the Atlantic Dialogues. I was actually here last year, and that last edition was, I would say, an intellectually stimulating adventure, to say the least. And having heard and seen the previous panels, obviously this Marshall Frank Hansen, and thank you for fixing my mic. Over here, please. Thank you, Embajador. Mr. Jonathan Miller. Thank you. And last but not least, Sir John Sawers. And as they take their seats, please, Jonathan. Sir John. Just a quick reminder that on the lovely AD 2025 application, you will find biographies for these gentlemen, and also the question that I have posed as a part of this panel. Please feel free to click on the interactivity tab and to click on one of the three possible potential answers to the question I posed. To set the stage, let's begin with a short video.
Global trade is changing rapidly. Economic nationalism, trade tensions, and rising conflicts are reshaping markets and alliances around the world. As these pressures intensify, tariffs, sanctions, and supply chain disruptions have turned interdependence into a weapon, reshaping how nations compete, cooperate, and survive. From the war in Ukraine to the rise of protectionist policies, a new war economy is emerging, calling into question the future of open and fair trade. And at the center of this shift stands the United States. Its America First approach has changed the game, with tariffs and subsidies felt across continents, testing old alliances and redefining ties between the North and South of the Atlantic. How are trade policies and financial tools being strategically used as instruments of geopolitical competition? What are the implications of the U.S.'s America First economic stance for transatlantic relationships and North-South relations in the Atlantic space? What role can the Atlantic region play in bolstering economic resilience and revitalizing multilateral trade cooperation amid these shifts?
So as you just heard, we're going to explore how trade wars and armed conflicts are converging into what can be called a new war economy reality, where economic interdependence is weaponized, supply chains are disrupted, and nations are forced to rethink their strategic alliances. Some of our guiding questions, as you just heard, will be: how are trade policies and financial tools being used as instruments of geopolitical competition? What vulnerabilities in global supply chains have recent conflicts exposed? And what role can the Atlantic region play in bolstering economic resilience? I'm going to ask all four panelists for short, brief introductory remarks. And if I can begin with you, Embajador Colomina, your work at NATO, I believe, offers critical insights into the security dimensions of today's trade landscape. The floor is yours, Embajador Colomina.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much, first of all, to the Atlantic Dialogues for the invitation. It's very good to be here in Rabat. It's actually a very pertinent question. The quick answer, in my view, is that without security, there's no prosperity. And the security context that we are experiencing today is clearly the most unstable, the most unsecure security context we've seen for decades, with a war, Russia's war of aggression to Ukraine that has broken peace in Europe after decades, with an open conflict in the Middle East, even though we've seen good news in the last couple of months thanks to US leadership and the mediation of Qatar, Egypt, Turkey, but still a lot of instability, with a great level of interconnectivity between the different challenges that we see. Probably the most illustrative example is Iranian Shahed drones being used in the Ukrainian battlefield.
Russia.
But there is lots of implications for the world coming from the war in Ukraine in terms of food security, energy security, that is affecting actually the economic security that we all need to move into prosperity. What have we decided to do regarding that is exactly building our economic resilience, taking decisions to protect as much as possible our critical infrastructures, our critical undersea infrastructures, the supply chains that are absolutely needed to increase the defense production. And we need to increase our defense production to give a proper answer to the things we are seeing with a 360 degrees approach, from all strategic directions, challenges and threats coming from different angles, geostrategic competition, Russia, China, but also Iran, the different challenges that affect our economies, our societies, the hybrid challenges that we are seeing lately that are disturbing our air traffic and affecting our economies. We took strong decisions in the last summit, the Hague Summit, where we decided to invest 5% on our defense investment. And that is not only linked to our military equipment, but also to our defense industry, our ability to produce and to give responses to the challenges we see. And the connection between security and economy is huge at every level. But I'll give you an example that actually links quite well with the previous panel with the two Latin American presidents on energy. Just a medium-sized data center today that is needed for artificial intelligence, medium-sized, consumes for one day the same level of electricity that a city of 100,000 people in one day.
Yeah.
You can imagine the level of energy that you need to produce if we want to use the level of artificial intelligence that we all believe we're going to be using in the next years. Therefore, the need to protect our supply chains, the need to make them safe, the need to avoid the dependencies that we've had, sometimes huge dependencies in energy, for instance, Europe towards Russia, that have been basically broken in the last years because we took the right decisions, but is a painful process, has an impact on economy. It's something that we need to do. It's something that will imply strong decisions, such as the ones we've been taking in the last 3 years. But it is my impression that those decisions will have to be deepened in the next years.
Embajador Colomina, thank you so much for that introduction. I should have reminded everyone that you're special representative, because you keep saying we. I think you're referring to NATO, which you represent here as the special representative for the southern neighborhood at NATO. Embajador Colomina, thank you so much. Now, if I can have a few introductory words from you, Air Vice Marshal Frank Hansen, hailing from the Gulf of Guinea Maritime Institute. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much again, and to the Policy Center for accepting to invite the Gulf of Guinea Maritime Institute to participate in such a a very important dialogue. As you are aware, the Gulf of Guinea shares in the prospects of the Atlantic basin, and therefore, by extension, the trade, and also the relationship that West Africa in particular has endeared with Europeans as far back as the Berlin Conference, that the same dialogue as we hear brought Europeans to West Africa and for resources, industrialization. Looking at the rise of China against the established great powers alone and what is happening in our sub-region, there's now the influx and footprints of great powers into our region. Fast forward, what we have realized is that when new powers are coming up, it comes with conflict. And one of the essence to see and predict is trade wars and tariffs. I will argue again that the Gulf of Guinea must position itself properly to engage the competition and the cooperation between great powers to provide us with a leverage. And here I want to comment again the Moroccan sub-Saharan linkages to the Atlantic, which is providing a corridor, an option for the Sahelian countries to also benefit at least from the investment that is coming into our sub-region. To conclude my initial remarks, I would also encourage our posture on the Gulf of Guinea coast, the threats that we're having from narcotics, the IUU fishing, engaging our partners, the partnership in the Yaoundé Code of Conduct, which the European Union is providing substantial support, all to improve our trade and industry and the development, human development in our sub-region.
Thank you so much, Air Vice Marshal. So fascinating since this morning we've been hearing so much about, narcotics, transnational crime, and how different governments, organizations are going about tackling this obviously huge challenge. Just very quickly in 20 seconds, you keep mentioning the Gulf of Guinea. I think it's important for those of us, and I include myself in that, who are maybe not necessarily very familiar with that part of the world. 3-4 countries that are concerned, thinking Ghana, Togo, Benin. Can you name some of the, so people can sort of, because we don't have a map up on screen.
Right, thank you. So Gulf of Guinea extends far back from Dakar, Senegal, all the way to Angola. So we have this architecture that has some maritime coordination centers under the Yaoundé Code of Conduct. And principally, the territorial side of the Gulf of Guinea includes Mali, and Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, which are sub-Saharan countries. Also, recently, you know what has happened there, coup d'etats and the terrorism, especially, and migration. And when we speak about Gulf of Guinea, we are talking about people. So I just want to end that people.
We'll get into that, Air Vice Marshal. Thank you so much, Frank Hansen, for that. Sir, Mr. Jonathan Miller, the floor is yours for introductory remarks, please.
Well, thank you so much. And
just a quick reminder that you're senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you again to the Atlantic Dialogues for hosting. I don't want to be the bad panelist to change the premise of the question.
Feel free.
But my point, I think, is going to look at some of the variables shaping this discussion. So the first obvious variable is that we're having this conversation here in Rabat in Morocco, but the things that impact this part of the world will not stay in this part of the world. So this leads to my point on interconnectedness. And the first point I'll raise on this is, and I think this was well raised by our friend at NATO, is that when we're talking about economy and trade, and if we had this discussion 10, 20, 30 years ago, we had this idea that we had the economy and trade discussion over here, and we had the national security and defense discussion over here. Those sort of lines are now blurred, I think, and we're seeing this quite clearly play out in a lot of different countries' politics. And the line between economy and national security is increasingly interlinked. The second theme is that there's an interlinkage of theaters as well. So we can have and we should have regional discussions. We should have Atlantic-focused discussions. We should have Indo-Pacific-focused discussions. But to understand that those theaters are increasingly interlinked. And that's a strategic reality that we all face. The second point, and I see on the screen here the red tape of tariffs, or the yellow tape here of tariffs, and the initial town hall was great. There was a lot of discussion about Trump and the exceptionalism and transactionalism. But I think, and this may seem provocative, but I think we have to, there's sometimes too much focus on the United States on this issue.
I agree.
And we forget our own agency and also our own ownership of certain ideas. So in particular, when we're talking about the war economy and we're talking about defense, and I can say this as a Canadian, we're struggling the most, one of the countries struggling the most in this trade war with the United States, but there's also areas that we could have been better on for several years. So there's an agency and an ownership that I think many allies have to focus on. And the sort of the final point before I get into a couple of prescriptions is that this is not entirely premised on one power. So there has been absent in a lot of the discussion. I know it's come up in some of the discussion is actually the role that China plays. And some of the destabilizing, if you think of a meal and you have that a la carte meal to international institutions and international trade, that's sort of the position that China's had on many issues. So with that being said, my sort of final point would be to look at some positive solutions. I think we actually need to sometimes look outside the region. And one area that I look to, I spent a lot of my career in Japan, is actually the way that Japan has viewed this through its free and open Indo-Pacific policy. This is looking at ways of open sea lanes of communication, free and open trade and investment. And frankly, they are on the front lines, as many countries in that part of the world, of some of these challenges. So I think we can really learn a lot from countries like Japan, some of the policies that are put forward by the new administration, Takaichi administration, to see how we can push back against some of this economic nationalism and this economic coercion. So my point is my final sort of comment here is not to downplay what's happening in the United States, but to realize there are other global players here. And I think what's happening in the Indo-Pacific is going to have significant impacts for this part of the world too.
No, I fully agree. One of the previous panelists, a former Latin American president, was mentioning the issue of demography, both comparing birth rate in Nigeria along to birth rate in the entire European continent, but also just if you take a look at demographics and looking at what Asia represents versus what Europe or even other continents represent, Africa included today. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Jonathan Miller. Sir John, former MI6 chief and executive chairman of the Newbridge Advisory. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. And the disadvantage of going last is everybody else has said what you might want to have said. And I agree with a lot of what has been, I agree with everything that's been said by my three fellow panelists. At the risk of falling into Jonathan's trap of talking too much about the United States, I think we do need to recognize that the biggest disruptor in the world at the moment is the occupant of the White House. And that he is focusing on what he sees as the economic security of the United States. Now, we would all, I think, question whether his approach is going to deliver on that, but there's no doubt that he is viewing security in a different way. He's viewing security as a way of rebalancing the global economy in a way which favors the United States. In the short term, probably. Well, it does in the long term. We'll have to wait and see. He is focusing on the Western Hemisphere as his priority. And it's part of a concept which isn't voiced that much by the US administration, but came through in the National Security Strategy that was published a week ago, which is that he and his colleagues in the US administration believe in the concept of spheres of influence. He believes that great powers should be the dominant players in their region. This shapes his approach to Russia and Ukraine.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, sure.
Do you think he actually co-wrote or even read that document? I mean, as a former spy chief with a keen sense of observation, you believe the U.S. president is aware of those concepts in that document?
I think this is a president who has an oral tradition, shall we say, that he's not a great reader of documents, and he does have severe dyslexia, so let's not mock his disabilities. But he is someone who has extraordinary political instincts about how to identify weakness in other people and in other countries. And he has a skill to exploit and manipulate those weaknesses, and that is the essence of him. He is not a student of policy rationale. He does not enter into the sort of debates that we're having here. The Heritage Foundation produced an 800-page document about the future of US policy under Trump. You can guarantee you know one person in the world who has certainly not read that 800-page document, and that is President Trump. But his administration is following many of the guidance, which is...
Does that mean that they're coherent in their approach?
I think this is a much more coherent administration than we were dealing with in the first Trump term. And we have to take it very seriously indeed. And the prospect of further disruption to the global economy is very real. We saw when Russia invaded Ukraine 4 years ago just what that did to the countries which were heavily dependent upon grain imports, for example, from Ukraine. And the price of bread suddenly went up around the world. The countries that subsidized their bread, like Egypt, the cost of the government of those subsidies went very high. Countries that depended upon Russian oil and gas suddenly found themselves needing to change their sources of supply. And that is a regional conflict in Europe. Now, what's going to happen if there's a wider conflict? I don't expect one, but we have to be ready for one. And I focused a lot on the United States, but as Jonathan rightly said, there's another very protectionist actor out there, and that's China. The way in which I think this was mentioned the other day, yesterday on a panel, that China essentially doesn't want to import anything from around the world. It'll import only what it absolutely has to. And it wants to produce inside China the goods and services so that its trade surplus, which is already very substantial, gets bigger and bigger and bigger and creates dependencies around the world. So you've got the two biggest economies in the world, United States and China, both operating in a way which exploits their economic advantage. And that's at the expense of the rest of us.
Thank you so much for looking towards China, because let's not make this entire panel about Donald Trump, even though it's incredibly tempting to do so. I think that the Chinese example is very relevant because it's one of these elephants, as you mentioned, in the room that does have flaws and weaknesses. I think their internal market is a real issue for the Chinese economy, their inability to sort of bolster internal consumption, which generates dependency on exports. But we'll eventually perhaps tackle that. Embajador Colomina, so you have, I think, in your portfolio what is known as the Southern Neighborhood Action Plan, which is about strengthening partnerships, correct me if I'm wrong, between the Middle East and Africa. How would you say, if you agree with the following statement, that this partnership, so the Southern Neighborhood Action Plan, helps mitigate the economic fallout from regional conflicts? And we heard about, you mentioned Russia, Ukraine, but there are other conflicts out there that we should not forget, especially on this continent, Sudan and other areas, Ethiopia, etc.
Yeah, indeed, it does. We have partners from Mauritania to the whole Maghreb, Israel, Middle East, the Gulf, 12 partners in the southern neighborhood region. We have conversations with countries that are not our partners, but could be our partners or our good interlocutors. For instance, in the Gulf of Guinea, in the Gulf, our partners do not include these days Oman and Saudi Arabia, but these are political actors that we engage with as well. And we believe that in many of the things we do, of course, those are related with security, those have implications for their own economies. We do plenty of things, for instance, on maritime security, on border security, on supply chains and critical infrastructures, things that we try to cooperate with many of our partners. Some of them, Morocco, for instance, particularly engaged in our cooperation, and that, in my view, could benefit more through a high level of cooperation. And I want to pick up on something that John said. And I have to agree, of course. I mentioned geostrategic competition in general. I mentioned specifically Russia, China, but also Iran. It's clear the name of the game these days is to be transactional. That's clear. But at the same time, I have to say that even the most transactional US administration, and probably that's the one we are seeing today, is much more involved in global affairs and much more effective in solving global problems than China is. And when you don't have a solution coming from the White House in many of the problems that we see, and even if those solutions are maybe not as liked as everybody would want, there's no second plan after that. So you don't have a Chinese plan to solve the Middle East crisis, or you don't have a Chinese plan to solve the Ukrainian crisis. There is probably a Chinese reflection
I think
about
there are
it.
plans, but they're not the same as your plans.
Well, but there is a plan that is not really paying any benefit.
Well, maybe the plan is to perpetuate
Exactly.
the crisis. In other parts of the
Exactly,
world.
but that's my point. At the end of the day, indeed, the US and this administration presents some complexities that we need to adapt to. We in NATO have, of course, very good relationship with our American friends and particularly with this US administration. Probably we don't have an option, is the biggest of our allies. But I have to say, and I'm very convinced about that, that would have shown the last months with Trump being in the White House is that the level of dependence for solving and putting an end to some of the problems that are affecting international relations on the ability of the US to influence those processes is enormous. And when the US is not either willing or capable to put an end to those problems, that's where I don't see a solution after the US. There is talks, there is conversations. We respect very much the ability to relate by many of the BRICS countries, China, South Africa, Brazil, etc. But there's no real solution that puts an end to those problems.
Yeah.
And as I said, it's very difficult to please everyone. But right now, we were able to achieve a ceasefire in the Middle East.
Fragile ceasefire.
But ceasefire still. I mean, the situation a few months ago were obviously worse.
The level of killing has lowered. It has not stopped
But it was
completely.
worse. But it was worse.
It was worse.
So I think at the end, we need to continue to engage with this U.S. administration. It's indispensable for international relations. We need to adapt to some of the things that they're saying. But I think we need to be, and that's where security comes, as close to realpolitik as possible. Security means at the end of the day realpolitik, principles, and of course the basis of the Washington Treaty and the thinking that we do have. But we need to be able to provide solutions to worldwide problems and to people's problems.
I agree with most of what you're saying. Jonathan Miller raised the point of, countries also needing to recognize, the fact that they put themselves in situations of dependency and perhaps lacking agency. Interestingly, without revealing anything, I think you hail from Spain, I think, on the issue of, defense versus GDP. I think that the Spanish government offers an interesting example of dealing with President Trump's asks to NATO. But sort of coming back to the Gulf of Guinea, Air Vice Marshal, you've highlighted the concept, which I find absolutely fascinating, of, and I quote, sea blindness and the underestimation of maritime insecurity in the Gulf of Guinea. And I think that the number that you put, and correct me, Air Vice Marshal, if I'm wrong, it accounts for $140 billion in annual trade. How can regional and international cooperation address some of the threats that you were mentioning previously and unlock the potential of, and we heard about this in previous panels, what we call the blue economy, so the economy revolving around the seas in those areas?
Thank you again. So here, let me reduce this big picture to what happens on the ground. Okay, so when we talk about the blue economy, then we're also referring to the continental side of things. So we're talking about tariffs, and the Gulf of Guinea, about 80% is an import-oriented economy. Everything is imported. So therefore, when it came to even the COVID disruptions in logistics chain and things like that, it impacts a lot on the people and then their development. Let me give you a very good example. When I was coming to this conference, I went to the beach and I met one 80-year-old woman. I said, "What do you want me to tell my friends when I go there?" Say, "Tell them we don't have fish." Because our lives as women depend on that industry. So we don't have fish. And it's not only fish, it means you don't have protein, isn't it? It means the children cannot go to school. It means the incomes of people are going to go down. Now, the infrastructure that links the littoral countries to the hinterlands, to the Sahel, are very weak. I mean, we don't have any expressways, highways to link the...
And when you say we don't have fish, is that because of the illegal fishing and the plundering of that resource by foreign actors?
Exactly. In fact, one of the data we got was that even Europeans have more fish to feed fish than we have for our own humanitarian development. Okay, so you fish from the Gulf of Guinea for aquaculture, isn't it? So these are, and then you have the Chinese fishing boats that also come for tuna and that kind of thing. But when you come to piracy, okay, and armed robbery at sea, it means our insurance is going to go up. And so when insurance goes up, then things become more expensive for us.
And when those Chinese boats show up, is there a regional mechanism to sort of counter the threat that poses to populations which you've just described? Are facing challenges that go from, increased poverty because their resources are being plundered to, other issues?
Yeah, bring it up. So it means you have to have the capacity to confront this threat at sea. And this is where our partners from NATO, the combined patrols and exercises that we've been conducting at sea. Recently, some of these patrols, even with the French Navy, resulted in the arrest of cocaine and drugs that are coming through West Africa to Europe. In terms of investing in the surveillance, in terms of detection, in terms of information sharing, well, to a large extent, is growing. But the capacity and the posture at sea is what remains a challenge for the Gulf of Guinea.
Thank you, Air Vice Marshal. Jumping from one part of the world to the next, you reminded us all that you hail from Canada. I wanted to ask you, Jonathan, back to one of the elephants in the room, the U.S. America First policy, which obviously has sparked both protectionism and calls for reform. And this is a very macro question, obviously, but how are these shifts reshaping transatlantic and north-south trade dynamics?
Thank you. It's a great question. And I think the first sort of point, I'll make 3 quick points on this. The first point is everyone's strategic reality in this room is different depending on your geography. So geography still matters. We may think we're in a hyper-connected world where geography doesn't have as much importance. But to give you a couple data points on this, nearly 70% of Canada's trade is with the United States. It simply makes sense. These are significant headwinds we're facing in that relationship. But it is not a luxury or an elective good for us to have a workable relationship with the United States. It's an existential good. It's something that is built into our existence. And I think our Mexican friends who are here today through this conference also mentioned that same point. So that's the first point. The second point, and I think our friend from NATO sort of mentioned this point too, we don't want to replace one set of vulnerabilities with another set of vulnerabilities. So one of my worries is in this zeal for diversification, that immediately we start thinking about, for example, going back to China.
Yeah.
We think of the opportunities in that market. Frankly, we've done that before. If you think of Back to the Future, where you had the DeLorean and you go back in time, we have been there before, where we had this idea of how we could tap into that economy. It did not work. So we have to be careful not to replace one set of vulnerabilities with the other. And then the sort of third and last point on the positive side is that does not preclude actually engaging with the whole scope of the rest of the world. So, there's a lot of talk on US-China naturally as the two largest economies, but thinking about the Global South, thinking about, for example, where we're here in Morocco, I see huge opportunities for a country like Canada to engage with countries like that. So one of the
in what area specifically, if we take the Moroccan example, and I don't want to put you on the spot, I don't know if you have concrete examples that you could
Sure. I think, agriculture, tech is one specific example. Food security, absolutely is something that's existential to all parts of the world. I think that's one area that we can work together. And also as a gateway, I think that all countries are looking for gateways into certain regions and certain players that we can work with to be a gateway. So from our perspective, I see Morocco as one of those gateways.
Thank you, Jonathan. Sir John, from your experience in intelligence and diplomacy, how are geopolitical risks like cyber attacks and resource competition, as we were just mentioning now with Air Vice Marshal Frank Hansen, reshaping global supply chains? And I know it's a very broad question, but what's your observation on this?
There's no doubt that cybersecurity is a serious risk that every government and every company needs to assess carefully. The scale and frequency of cyber attacks is just going up. If you're a government agency, if you're someone like MI6, then you're going to expect to have attacks from the Russian state, the Chinese state, and others who are trying to get our crown jewels. The reality is that for most commercial companies, the biggest threat comes from organized crime. Now, this organized crime can be based in one of these hostile countries, and maybe there are people there that get a rake-off from it, but it is essentially a criminal endeavor. Ransomware attacks, fraud, deep fakes, and so on. These are designed to skim off some money from commercial companies, and they pitch it, sadly, quite well, so that in general, it's best if companies resist these and reject these demands. But for any individual company caught in it, the balance of paying $50 million to get back your data so that you can resume your $500 million business is so overwhelming. So there's a good business model for the cyber attackers in this, which is a great shame. But I do think that the technology is going to be such an important part of the future. And we were talking yesterday, I think Masood Ahmed was talking about the sheer cost of these massive data centers that will host artificial intelligence.
And the energy needed to...
and the energy needed for it. Now, only a few places in the world are going to be able to do this. And so we've been dependent upon Saudi Arabia and other countries for providing us with oil and gas. We're going to be dependent in a different way on countries to provide us with the raw material, the large language models and other AI systems.
Unless we're able to develop sustainable ways of powering these, data centers, but I see that you're quite skeptical about that prospect.
I'm not. I'm all in favour of developing alternative means of energy as much as we can, but the sheer scale of this is going to increase energy, continue to increase energy demands. Now, what defence mechanisms do we put in place? It's very clear that both the United States and China, in their trade models, are trying to make other countries as dependent as possible on them and to minimize their own dependency on others. And I think this is a lesson for all of us, is to be very mindful as to where your dependencies lie and to make sure that you are not overly dependent upon any one supplier or any one country for a particular source of material. And there was a classic case with rare earth rare earths. The Chinese really caught the Americans' attention on this, and the Americans backed down when the Chinese used the rare earths metal
of course,
weapon against them.
In the trade war.
And you could say, well, so it gives the Americans a taste of their own medicine. But actually, this is something which the Chinese have had up their sleeve for some time. 15 years ago, in 2010, the Chinese used the rare earth mechanisms, rare earth weapon, against Japan. And Japan was forced to back down in a trade conflict 15 years ago because Chinese were ruthlessly using the rare earth weapon against them, and they had their industry was
just
totally
a
dependent
reminder
upon it.
to everyone, and I know that this is obvious to you, but that the rare earth component is, I would say, a vital part of so many different industries.
Well, that's why it's so important.
Exactly.
It's crucial for future technology. You see that a lot
and just
here.
everyday technology as well.
You see that a lot here in Africa. We've been very concerned for a long time about the conflict between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda and Uganda. This is not a war over territory. This is a war over
resources,
over critical minerals.
Yeah.
And we need to understand it as such that this, if you are overly dependent upon one source, or you have material which is of great value, then it can become a source of conflict.
I see that we have about 24, 25 minutes left. Ambassador Colomina, I know that you guys are big at NATO on the 360-degree approach to security. How does this translate into what we like to call economic resilience for NATO's southern partners, which you're in touch with?
I think I touched upon some of the topics that are most usually part of our conversations with our partners in the South. Of course, it depends very much on their own capabilities, also on their own will to invest more or a bit less in the relationship with NATO and the West in general. But we work well on energy security, maritime security, protection of critical infrastructures, those elements that are very beneficial for their own security and very beneficial for their own security. Then there is a political side of this whole thing. And as I said before, indeed, transaction is the name of the game, but at the same time, the more relationship you're able to build with the different parts of the world. We have partners in 35 countries in the world, from Colombia to New Zealand are our partners, apart from the 12 partners that I mentioned before in the southern neighborhood. So I think it is relevant to continue to work politically with all of our partners. Yes.
I was just going to ask, and if you can clarify, how do these southern nations go about, being part of this Southern Neighborhood Action Plan? Is it an application? Do you guys go to them? Do they come to you? And if you just can clarify, what are the criteria based on which you say yes to Saudi Arabia and no to another country?
The Southern Neighborhood Action Plan as such was approved in the Washington Summit in 2024. It is just a consequence of political will to bring the South higher in the agenda of NATO. We've been working with our partners since the 90s and the 2000s. With the Gulf, we celebrated 20 years of relationship last year. With the Med, 30 years of relationship last year as well. But we decided to have more of a strategy, a comprehensive approach to the South, where we had different pillars, from political engagements to practical cooperation to physical presence in the region. I just opened our first ever political office in Jordan, in Amman, for instance.
When?
A couple of months ago.
Okay.
We have a training and education center in Kuwait that was opened in 2017.
Can I tell you why I'm surprised? The document that Sir John was referring to, the National Security Strategy that was just published and has us, commenting a lot on it, specifically mentions how skeptical this American administration is about NATO expansion. And despite this, you're telling me that you opened a new office in Jordan 2 months ago.
Well, let me correct you there, because this is not expansion. And you ask me, how does it work with partners? And then I'll go into the expansion. How does it work with partners? We're not in the business of changing any partner. Okay. It is partners that come to us and believe that their security would be better if they link their efforts to NATO's efforts. It is, for instance, part of the conversations that we're having with the Gulf of Guinea, with some of the countries in the Gulf of Guinea. But I can assure you that is a cumbersome process. It needs, of course, the North Atlantic blessing. The 32 allies need to accept that, and it takes years for every partner to become a partner. But that's a partner. The expansion, probably then the national security strategy was referring to, is the allies. 32 allies and going beyond. And I honestly think that the national security strategy, which is of course a strategic level document, has to be taken from what it is. The implementation of the policies of the US in some aspects will be different. In some aspects, in my view, will have a nuanced approach. The direction of travel is sort of clear. They're, yes, asking to rebalance the presence of the US, having the Europeans and Canada efforts leading the way in many places, particularly in Europe. But I don't think we'll see the Americans leaving a vacuum behind. What they want is that others take the lead in some places where they used to be leading, and they believe that they don't need to lead, but just complement some of those efforts.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Can I just
Please,
add
Sir John.
just on that?
And then we'll go to questions
You used
from
the
the
word
audience.
NATO expansion as if NATO was elbowing
I was quoting.
elbowing out in space. Actually, the enlargement of NATO that took place in the 1990s and 2000s was because countries which had rediscovered their freedom after the collapse of the Soviet Union
Made a choice.
were desperate to have their security ensured.
They still
And so
are.
they were desperate to join NATO and took a lot of action in order to meet the requirements of being NATO members. So this idea that NATO somehow is pushing out the boundaries is a misconception. It is countries who desperately need security who want to have a relationship or membership with NATO, which drove the enlargement of the organization.
The question is...
I said I was going to come back to the expansion thing. The expansion word, of course, is something that we don't like. We talk about open door policy, we talk about enlargement, but it is a process where our allies ask us to become members of the organization because they fear for their security,
Exactly. That's my
just
point.
as it happens with Sweden and Finland. So and it's actually, I mean, the elephant in the room of this conversation is the Russians talking about this.
Of
when
course.
the Russians talk about this, the answer that we've been given to the Russians for many years, not these years because we don't talk with them anymore, is clear. It is your actions that are creating a desire in those nations to try to be secure because they feel unsafe because of your own behavior.
At this point, we're at the heart of the conversation, I think, and I'm going to turn to the audience to take questions. And here's why I feel, and this is very selfish, that we're at the heart of the conversation. You mentioned, Sir John, countries looking for security. And I think considering the kind of instability and chaos, as I saw in one of yesterday's word clouds that we're currently seeing and some of us undergoing, people are asking themselves around the world, where would my most reliable source of security stem from today? Who can my most reliable partner, not just in the very short term, but medium, long term, be when it comes to safety and security for my country and my people? If we have questions from the audience, and I saw one hand go up, I'm going to take about 3 to 5 different questions. Please keep them short and on topic so we can take as many questions as possible. I have a small brain, so I'm going to try to take notes. I think this hand was up first, and then I'll go over here, and we'll take 5 to 7 questions. I'm going to take notes.
Landry Signé, Policy Center for the New South and Brookings. So many of the things that are being discussed, I think, relatively describe what we can call a oligo, let's say polarchy, if you can call, or a oligo multilateral neo-mercantilism. So on one hand, we have those tools for trade which are used to ensure dominance. And perhaps one of the challenges now is the fact that when we think about the main driver, we think about the US. But this dynamic is also valid across sub-regions where we have a small group of leaders which will apply a relatively neo-mercantilist policy. So, which strategy, whether at the regional level or at the global level, will you have or propose for the smaller actors to react to the multilateral or to the neo-mercantilist oligo multilateralism.
Thank you. Thank you. I see that the president has a question. I must go to him first.
You were in a think tank. We're a clinic of psychoanalysis of public policy. Can't policymaker, none of you, it's not targeted to you, but you have long experiences. Can policymakers just say, I don't know? I'm lost. This is too much. Just to start a serious sort of discussion to have solutions. Until we do that, I don't think that's what we teach our students. And anyways, you're not going to be elected because it shows when it's not convincing. And that's why we have the political landscapes we have. So just want you to share with us your experience as policymakers, and of course not in your current functions for those who have a function. Thank you.
Okay. A couple more questions, please. I heard here in the back. Who said here in the back? Gentleman over there.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Diego Marroquin,
yes.
Trade Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I wanted to bring back the conversation on trade real quick. Last night over dinner we discussed the national security strategy and how the US is moving away from strategic competition with China to something closer to power accommodation or major power collusion. Mexico and Canada were barely mentioned in the NSS, despite being the US's largest trading partners and also key in managing hemispheric security and immigration flows. My question to Jonathan mainly. Canada has largely mirrored the US approach on tariffs, imposing, for example, a 100% tariff on Chinese electrical vehicles. Now that the US is scaling back tariffs and other defensive measures on China, what do you think will happen to Canada's strategy? Will they maintain tariffs even if that makes them less competitive vis-a-vis the US, now that they're lowering tariffs? Or is this an opportunity to reevaluate their strategy vis-a-vis China? Just real quick, Mexico, for example, just put tariffs on China, and Canada has also tariffs on China. And what happens to them if the US is reducing tariffs on China? Doesn't that make them less competitive?
Would you mind just stating perhaps your first name and your affiliation? I forgot.
Yes, Diego, a trade fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Thank you.
Also former Adele. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. A couple more questions, please. Right here, gentleman in the first row. With your first name and your affiliation, please, sir.
Yes, thank you. My first name, Fernando Cardoso. I'm from Lisbon. My question to you is, one thing is the Trump administration, and the other thing is the United States of America. What I mean is, what do you think about the dynamics? I can understand why Trump was elected, because of dynamics inside the U.S., mostly on economic and employment. But my point is, we are speaking as if Trump will stay in power for the next 10 years. Is that we are a little afraid of doing this? And really, the United States, as let's say, is more than this administration that is, let's say, is against the rest of the world. All the world, without exceptions, but Israel. Is this sustainable?
Is this sustainable? Thank you, Mr. Cardoso. One last question, please. Sustainable.
Lady over there. We've not had a lady. We've not had a lady.
We haven't had any ladies ask any questions. You, ma'am, please. Right over here. Thank you so much. And that'll be the last question, please.
I agree with my president, Mr. Ainaoui. There's a time where we should really gather and look for more, I would say, pragmatic solutions to all what's going on. Because these ongoing global conflicts are fundamentally rewriting the global market by disrupting supply chains, shifting trade flows, spiking energy costs, fueling inflation, increasing investor risk aversion, etc. So, I mean, so many things about inflation and employment. what can be done in a very pragmatic way without always thinking that, these raw materials, we cannot find them elsewhere than Africa. Can we just be not dependent that much on AI and technology and think more of the humanity as a whole? Thank you.
You're very welcome. That'll be the last question. Let's start with the first one, the gentleman from Cameroon over here who was referring to 19th century mercantilism, that approach that is driving a lot of U.S. foreign policy, it seems, these days. And you asked, and correct me if I'm wrong, which strategy at the global level can be implemented by some of you refer to these countries as the, and I quote, smaller actors. Air Vice Marshal Frank Hansen, I feel like this is a good one for you.
Again, the dual nature of our maritime security strategy is a domain for economic statesmanship and coordination mechanism. I would rather want to reduce this question to what we have in the Gulf of Guinea, in Africa in particular. For example, we have the African Free Trade area, which is one of the mechanisms where we think that these strategies should be reduced in a manner that we can find some.
When you say reduced, you mean more localized? Like, I guess the way that I understand this question is I guess one of the reflexes has been to look towards, I don't know, Brussels, NATO, the EU Commission, or Washington. Is now time to become more autonomous, more localized in your approach?
But we've done that for 500 years in Africa, isn't it? For 500 years, we've done that between Africa and Europe. We have nothing to show. So coming to the reality, what we have today is how do these mechanisms work with what we have currently, like African free trade? So this national security strategy from the US, NATO's strategies should meet us halfway and give us a space and listen to us.
Sure.
And like the president said, should we say no? I would say we should say it depends, how it also brings our interest to bear. This would be my very simple way of looking at it.
Thank you for transitioning so elegantly towards President El Ainawi's question, which I'll link up with Madame's question also from the Policy Center for the New South. Embajador Colomina, is this a time in human history where people like you just say, I don't know?
I don't think I can afford saying I don't know. Honestly, I get the point.
You'll get in trouble if you say that.
But that's why we have think tanks to get into policy. But no, I mean we pretty much know what we have to do, honestly. But probably the quick answer is we can't afford not knowing what we have to do. I've been asked in many occasions, for instance, is NATO capable to deal at the same time with East challenges, very close to the historical trends of NATO, and Southern challenges? And my answer is, do we have an option? We don't have an option.
We don't.
Security is too relevant for us. Security is too relevant for everything we do. When you look at the Sahel, for instance, which is an area that falls under my responsibility as well, and the only Sahelian partner we have is Mauritania. Most of the problems you see, of course, there are root causes, but most of the problems you see, you won't be able to solve them until you have a decent level of security. It's basically impossible to work with a country that doesn't have control over its territory. Yeah. And at the end of the day, the elites of those countries, most of the time, will go for what's happening these days, a bunkerization of their own capitals, of their own elites, trying to bring Praetorian guards that will protect them. But the rest of the territory is basically a free ride. For whom? For illicit trafficking, for, yes, of course, terrorism, but terrorism that very quickly moves into a business plan on narcotics that at the end of the day have more power, more economic and financial resources than those states. So at the end, security is essential, and I don't think we can afford not being clear about that. I do think that small actors I have lots of things to say. I think that multilateralism continues to be a way to go, either regional multilateralism, that's NATO or the European Union, or global multilateralism. We all know how difficult these days are for the UN, and we have appealed in many occasions to the responsibility of global actors, Russia, China being P5s, and we need them to be responsible,
engaged,
and we need them to respect the UN Charter and the principles that we all abide with.
Thank you, Ambassador Colomina. Of course, John, I was going to ask you the next question, so please, I'll transition to the next question.
And I'll try to maybe bundle a few points.
No problem. Take your time.
That's a really important reflection that came from our host there from the Policy Center. And I'll take the bait as someone who formerly collected a government paycheck and no longer does, so I don't maybe have someone ready to axe me. I think you're right. I think that's a really perceptive point that sometimes we do have to say that we're losing our direction. If you thought about 2 or 3 years ago, our neighbor to the south talking about potentially annexing us as a country, and you could say it's done in jest, you could say whatever, but that was not on our scene of potentially what we anticipated. So absolutely, we are still trying to navigate ourselves, but the caveat here is you still have to go on. You know, this is not that when you're in the foreign policy world, you cannot drive a car and just stop and say, okay, I'm lost. I don't know where to go. You have to find a way. So I think it is important to recognize and to have that analysis that things are shifting, things are different.
But piggybacking off of that metaphor you just used, I do think, however, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there are times, and this certainly is one of them, where you do stop the car.
Yeah.
You can't just drive in any random direction because you want to keep momentum and movement. I think there's a time to reflect, and that's what you were doing earlier. And I like the fact that you said that we, meaning, you know, I think you were speaking on behalf of Canada, although you don't officially represent the country you hail from, and I understand that we also put ourselves in a position where we allowed for this, you know, aggression, verbal for the moment, to be inflicted upon ourselves. So I think the idea, and this is maybe what the question is, and it goes back to also Mr. Cardozo's question, there's a lot of reacting to what's coming out of the White House. And so, you know, how do you break that? And what lessons are learned from how did we become so exposed and so, you know, dependent on whatever is said or done from, you know, Pennsylvania Avenue?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think maybe I'll just take this opportunity to quickly pivot to that China question because I think it's interlinked to this.
The EVs and the tariffs.
The one on the EVs is that A plus B doesn't always equal C. So yes, we have, as I mentioned earlier, we have the tensions with the United States. But some of the reasons that we've put the tariffs, for example, on EVs for China is because it's not a fair market competitor. We do not have market access like in China, like that they have in Canada. They, in many senses, are sort of rigging that system to be able to export those electric cars at extremely cheap rates, in addition to all the other factors. So I think that's one important factor. And then again, to reinforce this point of vulnerabilities is that, look, there's a lot of opportunity there, but there's also vulnerabilities. And we've seen it, many countries around this table and in this room have seen this, is that sometimes when politics go the different way, and we've seen this in our pork industry and our soybean industry, actually with our citizens being detained as well, that those tools can be levered and weaponized, you know, at the snap of a finger. So I think it's that clarity is knowing that, look, yes, there's market opportunity, but big powers, and China would frame into this, do not see things. Their foreign policy tools are not compartmentalized the way that we may think we compartmentalize our tools.
Thank you, Jonathan. Sir John, a gentleman posited the following, said that, you know, Trump will not be in power forever. And I'd like to be a little provocative in saying that I think that you can no longer work off of that assumption in the sense that he may not physically be in power forever, but his ideas will probably remain. And piggybacking off of what Jonathan was saying, I think that what we're seeing coming out of the White House today was in the works for some time under previous administrations, including Democratic ones. So Trump may not be a rupture, a break, but actually a clarification, an acceleration of something that was already there, and thinking that we can just weather this storm and we'll see sunshine whenever the next U.S. election is, and it'll all go back to, is that the wrong approach, or how do you go about looking at this?
Well, you sound like a panelist, Galahad. You've answered your own question. I agree more with you than I do with Fernando. I think it's unwise to think that America is going to flip back to the America that we knew pre-Trump. It may be a Democratic candidate may win in 2028. It may be another Republican with a different background. But America is changed. And America's relations with Europe have changed. America's relations with Latin America have changed. And America is finding a modus vivendi alongside China, alongside Russia. It's a very different world. And if you're hoping that things is just a nightmare which goes on for 4 years and then you'll wake up and things will go back to how it was before, that is a very unwise strategy. Hope is not a strategy. You've got to plan for a real changing relationship with Europe. People have said, what do small countries do? How do we manage this? Well, one of our lessons in Europe is to band together. Why is Trump and his administration so hostile to the European Union? Well, perhaps it's because the European Union's economy is just as big as America's, and it can't be pushed around in the same way that the economy of smaller countries can be pushed around. A sense of regional coming together, of getting rid of regional disputes. It's very easy to have a disagreement with your neighbor. It's much harder to find common cause with your neighbor. But in a world of such pressure, of such division, of breaking down of the old rules, if you don't have a degree of regional unity and a common regional approach, then your chances of standing up to what we're seeing in Russia and China and the United States is going to be that much more difficult.
Thank you, Sir John. That'll be your conclusion. I'm going to ask all three of you gentlemen for 20-second conclusion, so 2 sentences. And while you're thinking through and preparing these conclusions, I'd like to ask the gallery if they can put up the question that I had introduced on the application. And I hope that you all logged into your 80-2025 application and clicked on the interactivity tab and answered that question. And if you haven't done so, please feel free to do so right now, because we'll see the answer show up on screen, hopefully. 20 seconds. Embajador Colomina, please.
Very quickly, where I started, I think security is the basis of our prosperity, is the basis of economic prosperity, social economic cohesion. And at the end, if you look at the last 20 years, the countries that were more stable and more secure have been the countries that have been, at the end, more prosperous. So we need to work on our own security, and of course NATO will continue to partner up with every country that wants to do that.
Security and prosperity. Thank you, Embajador Colomina. Air Vice Marshal Frank Hansen.
Thank you once again. And we heard that we are latecomers. We are not latecomers. They are prospects. And now we are seeing the current Moroccan linkage of their ports to the Sahelian countries. I see that project, like the Lobito corridor, as being one of the most important strategy after the Suez Canal. So we should focus on it, and that can create some escape and prosperity for the Gulf of Guinea. Between the Gulf of Guinea and the Sahelian countries. So that's what I think is a way forward for West Africa.
Frank Hansen. Jonathan Miller, your conclusion.
3 words where I started. First, interconnectedness, second, agency of players, and third, towards building resilience. So we've talked about a lot of dark issues, which I think we should talk about and we need to continue talking about. But there's 2 sides of the interconnectedness stuff. If we take our own agency, if we use our own agency to build resiliency within our supply chains, it can be successful.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Sir John. Thank you, Frank Hansen. Thank you.
Panelists are asked to remain on stage for a group photo.
And thank you all for your questions and your listening. Thank you.